was born in 1925. I'm going to talk about him because of his 100th anniversary. All right. So, hello. Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome to Music is a Revelation, and this is Gregory Muna, aka Master Mu, and this is an ongoing series of conversations about the my creative process as a composer and how I work with sound and how I use sound to express emotion and psychological states and energy states that I feel inside of myself, and how I try to communicate that with you. And I try to connect this to my influences, my teachers, and those who I respect, those who I consider to be inspirations and predecessors. So, and I'm also connecting it beyond music to larger questions of art, politics, theology, psychoacoustics, brain science, quantum physics, to the extent that I can speak on any of these topics at all. And as part of this, I give tribute to musicians and composers who I consider to be especially important, especially great. And we've already had conversations about the importance of Beethoven, Bach, Bartók. I'd like to move the timeline up a little bit more to closer to the present day. And in terms of modernism, 20th century modernism. And I've said earlier that I consider myself to be a kind of neo-modernist or perhaps a neo-futurist, which is that I'm very much concerned with the idea of moving musical language forward. And, you know, there are different schools of thought on this topic. Some people maintain that there's no such thing as language moving forward, that there's simply a succession of styles and each style is dependent upon society, and that's true. I mean, but within each moment in society, composers do try to push the boundaries of what they can express within that. So, and to the extent that there is a continuous civilization, you know, that there is any continuity from the past to the present, that means that there is a constant ability to push the parameters of what can be organized and what can be expressed. And if we're talking about the idea of sonic perception, and if our goal is optimizing, increasing sonic perception, and then the idea is that we want to integrate greater and greater degrees of complexity in one perceptual unity. And this idea of maintaining unity, complexity under unity, is a fundamental idea of modernism, but which goes all the way back, really, to the dawn of civilization. Because Pythagoras, and we talked a little bit about Pythagoras, we'll always come back to Pythagoras, who is the father of Western musical theory. You know, for him, the primordial idea is the oneness. And that idea of oneness and unity is essential from Pythagoras to the philosophy of Plato, and Plato based a lot of his philosophy on the musical and mathematical ideas of Pythagoras. He had the same ideas about the maintaining unity within diversity in sonic phenomena, which is essential to Plato's teaching. And then from there to the rest of, you know, the development of Western civilization, the rise of the church modes, the ultimate transition from medieval to common practice tonality. And we've talked about that, about the idea of the embedding various levels of 1-5-1 and the idea of the continua. We talked about the common practice of Bach But we really haven't talked about how we go beyond the common practice of the continuo, of tonal counterpoint, of embedding the relationships of the tonic and dominant, or of the ratio of 2 to 3 on different structural perceptual levels of time, of temporal and rhythmic and pitch levels, right? Which was really sort of the essence of common practice, especially as summarized and encapsulated by the theoretical framework of Schenker. We'll come back to Schenker. But looking at a post-tonal and sort of, perhaps post-Schenkerian way of looking at things brings us to Pierre Boulez. And Pierre Boulez, we're honoring the memory of Pierre Boulez because this would have been the 100th anniversary of his birth year. He was born March 26th of March 1925, so this past week, 100 years. So we're in his birth centennial week, March 26, 1925, and he lived a long life. He lived until January of 2016, and so he lived, I believe, to the age of 90. And he was a French composer, conductor, and a writer, founder of several musical institutions. To the general public internationally, he was known primarily as an orchestral conductor. And I heard him many times as an orchestral conductor. And as a conductor, he conducted sort of the standard symphonic repertory, Mahler, Bruckner, and so on and so forth. He began as a specialist in 20th century modernism. He was a student of Olivier Messiaen, was his teacher at the Paris Conservatoire, and he began as a conductor associated with for his very precise renditions of the masterpieces of the first phase of 20th century modernism. So he was famous for his orchestral conducting of very difficult works like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, Bartók. So we talked about the orchestral works of Bartók. For example, in addition to hearing him conduct Stravinsky, I heard him conduct, in high school, I heard him conduct the Miraculous Mandarin of Bartók, the Concerto for Orchestra, Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celesta, the various concertos, the piano concertos. And he was great in all of them. So he was a great conductor. And but he was equally important, really, as a teacher and as a composer. And I want to focus a little bit on his thought. I also was able to attend some lectures and master classes that he gave. I did not study with him. He only taught in France for a brief period, long before I was born, in the 1950s and the 1960s. But I studied with people who worked with him. I studied at the School of Sonology in The Hague, and many of my teachers there had been his colleagues and collaborators at his electronic music school, his institution, IRCAM, IRCAM, which is short for the Institut de Recherche et Coordination Acoustique Musique, IRCAM, in Paris, and where he also led the Ensemble Intercontemporain, which I also heard perform many times. And his life and work, in addition to being a great champion of the standard repertory, as he got older, he became more of a general conductor and less of a specialist in modernism. I mean, from sort of the mid-1970s onwards, he became also famous as a conductor of Wagner and so on. And, even with, very apparently conservative music like Bruckner and so on. And so he was a brilliant composer, and his achievement seems paradoxical in the sense that nowadays people like to tear down this sort of very serious intellectual modernism that was so dominant in the post-World War II period. This is when he was a young composer, and he was a student during the war years, and his first published pieces of music came right after the war. And so he he also studied non-Western music. He said that, quote, "I almost chose the career of an ethnomusicologist because I was so fascinated by the music. It gives a different feeling of time." He was talking about Balinese, Japanese, and African music. And all of those musics have influenced me very deeply as well. I went to Bali and I studied Balinese music. I've also studied and performed Japanese gagaku music and African drumming. So all of those influences, in addition to the Western influence, I share with him. He represents, in his musical evolution, he went through different phases, and they really influenced me very deeply. And so one phase that he went through immediately after his study with the great French composer Olivier Messiaen, and we'll come back to Messiaen later, was his development of his own style of serialism. And serialism was an outgrowth of 12-tone composition. So I won't talk about 12-tone composition just yet, because I would have to talk about the life and the work of the great founder of 12-tone composition, which is Arnold Schoenberg, and I will soon talk about Schoenberg's personal musical journey, his evolution from romanticism and chromatic tonality to free atonality to organized chromaticism in the form of 12-tone music. And Schoenberg's students were interested in taking Schoenberg's 12-tone idea further and finding other possibilities of formal organization that were implied by that. In other words, they didn't just want to use a 12-tone chromatic harmony to write traditional fugues, sonatas, and variations, although they did, but they also wanted to look beyond that to find out if there were organizing principles in the material, the organization of the sound itself, which could create form. And this led to the breakthrough of total serialism, which for Boulez happened in the early 1950s, between 1950 and 1952. Prior to that, in the late 1940s, he was writing chromatic and 12-tone music that was more similar in feeling just to the Schoenberg, or perhaps a little bit to the Webern style, but he gravitated more towards Webern and came up, and then he was able to synthesize sort of the very highly, extremely detailed and disciplined Webern style with ideas from his teacher, Olivier Messiaen, in terms of organizing. Now, Messiaen was a modal composer. Messiaen was a church composer and inspired by the church modes. But Messiaen, who also studied non-Western music, who also studied like Balinese and African and Japanese music, and as well as early church music, had the idea of organizing elements of a composition, creating not just modes of pitches like church modes, but also modes of rhythm, modes of duration, and so on, as a type of extended modality. And so, for example, a piece that Messiaen wrote when Boulez was his student, for example, Olivier Messiaen, and we'll talk about Messiaen and his great achievement also, wrote, for example, his Quatre Études de Rhythm, four rhythm studies, was a set of four piano compositions that Olivier Messiaen wrote in 1949 and 1950. And when Boulez was a student, and of those four pieces, it was the second piece of the group of four, which really inspired Boulez the most. In the French title of number two is the Mot de valeur et d'intensité, which, I mean, part of my poor French pronunciation in English would be translated as mode of durations and intensities. And in that short piano piece, what Messiaen did is that he created modes of different set of pitch, duration. He used numerical organization to not only to pitch, but also to duration, dynamics, and then mode of attack, creating timbres. And his treatment of the parameters is modal and not serial, meaning the elements are treated simply as a scale, and that he writes in, and he doesn't make a specific ordering. So in 12-tone music, there's a specific ordering. So it doesn't determine the form, but there are separate layers of organization. There are modes. He created a group of 36 pitches, 24 different durations, 12 different attacks, 7 dynamics. And for example, the duration scale is separated into 3 overlapping scales, which the composer referred to as tempi: slow, medium, and fast, high, middle, and low registers, which correspond to the high, middle, and low registers of the piano, and those occur in simultaneous superimposition. And the first tempo uses 12 chromatic durations applied to the 16th note, and then to the quarter note, and then the half, and so on, right? And the 16th note, the 8th note, and the quarter note. And so when Messiaen composed this piece, which was so deeply influential on Boulez, Messiaen said, the durations, the intensities, and the attacks operated on the same plane as the pitches. The combination of modes reveals colors of durations and intensity. Each pitch of the same name has a different duration, attack, and intensity for each register in which it appears. The influence of register upon the quantitative, phonetic, and dynamic soundscape, and the division into 3 temporal regions imbues the passage with the spirit of the sounds that traverse them, creating the potential for new variations of colors. And this was tremendously influential on the young Pierre Boulez and his way of thinking. And so this led Boulez to the idea of the serialization of rhythm, dynamics, and other elements of music. Now, I have to say that this was partly fostered, by the work of Olivier Messiaen and his analysis students, including Boulez in post-war Paris. And Messiaen had been working on these ideas actually starting during the wartime. He first used a chromatic rhythm scale in his Vingt Regards sur l'Enfant Jesus in 1944, the 20 glances at the baby Jesus, but he did not employ a rhythmic series until 46-48 in the 7th movement of his Turangalila Symphony, and I'll devote another episode to Messiaen's Turangalila Symphony. And So these same principles were developed simultaneously, independently, and actually slightly earlier by the great Milton Babbitt, and who I did have the opportunity to study with, and who was also a dear friend and acquaintance and mentor. And I will talk about Babbitt's great influence on me and how the greatness of his music on a separate installment. But today I'm going to focus more on Boulez. So, but you can say that in this period of the sort of the 5 years after World War, from moving from like 1945 to 1950, there were on both sides of the Atlantic, Babbitt working here in mostly at Princeton, in New Jersey and New York, and Boulez working in Paris, and to a lesser extent, Stockhausen was developing, Karlheinz Stockhausen was developing similar ideas, working in Germany, and we'll also have opportunity to talk about the great achievements and contributions of Karlheinz Stockhausen as well as Babbitt. And so what they were trying to get, it was not a modal use of these non-pitch elements of music, but a serialized or ordered use. Yeah, and so several of the composers were trying to get rid of thematicism. Yeah. So instead of a recurring referential row, quote, each musical component is subjected to control by a series of numerical proportions. And this was, the idea was to create maximum information for every note, to create every point of music to have a maximum value of comprehensibility in terms of determination, in terms of rhythm, pitch, mode of attack, envelope, all of that. And in this serial system, of which Boulez was the leader, pieces were structured by closed sets of proportions. And Boulez and the composers of that period sought to avoid repetition and symmetry on all structural levels, working with a limited number of elements. And I think the limited number of elements is the extremely important thing. And we'll continue to look at more specific examples of that. Getting back to our birthday honoree, since we are honoring the March 1925, that is, say, the March 26, 1925 birthday of Pierre Boulez, we are looking at his breakthrough in terms of total serialism from 1950 to 1952. And so right around the same time that Messiaen was writing, and the same workshop, Messiaen was never a strict 12-tone composer in the Schoenberg or Weber sense, whereas Boulez was. So Boulez tried to synthesize his understanding of Weber with the rhythmic and other sort of modal innovations of Olivier Messiaen. Boulez's first sketches towards total serialism appeared in his string quartet pieces, Livre pour Quatuor, but he continued revising that. A characteristic of Boulez's work is that his work went through lifelong revision. I mean, the first version of his string quartet was 1948-49. He continued revising it up until the last years of his life, up and through 2011, 2012. And and then he began really working out rigorous applications of a completely integrated technique in which he was trying to work with every aspect of sound, not just pitch. So in the early 1950s, Boulez began to apply this technique rigorously, ordering each parameter into sets of 12 and prescribing no repetition until all 12 had sounded. And that was very different from Messiaen. As you saw, Messiaen used different sets. He used 36, different pitches and different 12. He didn't, just stick with 12. And so this creates a constantly changing series of rhythms and durations. And it's interesting to quote the music critic Alex Ross here. He says here that this has the effect of erasing at any given point, previous impressions the listener may have formed. Quote, "The present moment is all there is." So this implies a new type of listening where you're not thinking about themes, variations, developments, and so on. And this can be extremely annoying, or it can be infuriating to people who don't want to just listen to each sound as it unfolds. And these pieces are challenging. I mean, but I'll discuss my critique later. I want to give my tribute to, I think, the originality and the genius of it before I make any sort of critical comment. And this was emotionally very important for his generation who survived the war. They wanted to create a tabula rasa. After the war, they had a sense of like starting over from scratch. And for example, there's a famous anecdote of when Boulez wrote his second piano sonata, which is a very, very tough work, 1947, 1948. It's a big piano sonata, half an hour work, and it's very difficult to perform. It's hardly ever performed. I mean, nowadays, Pierre Laurent Aymar, he performed it as a tribute to Boulez a couple weeks ago. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make that performance. But Pierre Laurent Aymar is one of the greatest, along with, Yu Wang. I mean, one of the pianists who pushed technique to the real limit of what's possible, working with today's composers, Ligeti, so on. Also, who I had the opportunity to take some master classes with at the School of Sonology in The Hague, and Pierre Laurent Aymar was there and was premiering Ligeti's wonderful new etudes for piano and giving master classes on how they were structured. But the second piano sonata, it's very violent music, as Griffith said, Paul Griffith said, the violence of the music is not just superficial, it's expressive of a need to obliterate what had gone on before, kind of a musical detonation, blowing up of the past. And so when Pierre Boulez met the great American composer Aaron Copland, Boulez played the second sonata for him. Copland was mystified. Copland said, "But must we start a revolution all over again?" And this is interesting because Copland, was of the older generation who basically were present at that first modernist revolution, that first revolutionary change of music, which began in the early 20th century with the pioneers, with Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Boulez, and that first generation of modernists, they reached a sort of an apex of in the just before and after World War I, and then there were attempts to integrate their innovations into traditional languages that started in the 1920s and through the 1930s. So Copeland was part of that group who were trying to integrate the innovations of the early modernists into more traditional forms that, and it didn't feel that it was necessary to re-revolutionize music after the war, but Boulez felt it was. Boulez, when Aaron Copland asked Boulez, "But must we start a revolution all over again?" Boulez replied, "Yes, mercilessly." All right. So his affirmative yes and his sort of mercilessness, his merciless sort of response are very characteristic of his personality. So the early works, which were tried to control every aspect, were not entirely successful. For example, one of his pieces, Polyphony X or 10, was withdrawn, and for 18 instruments, and he also withdrew two pieces done with primitive electroacoustic technology, done with tape manipulation of sound. Those were two musique concrète études. Musique concrète, or concrete music, was primarily in France, was a precursor to electronic music. Before the rise of synthesizers and computers, it was an attempt to create artificial sound through tape manipulation and manipulating of basically of reel-to-reel tape inputs and creating new sounds then by speeding up, slowing down, adding processing, and so on. That was also withdrawn. One of these pieces which he did not withdraw, but which is very, very hard to listen to, is Structures, Book 1 for two pianos. And that's from 1951 to 1952. I find it very difficult to listen to this simply because the sound of the two pianos is very percussive, and the sound of it is hard on my ears. If you're interested in, again, I'm chatting with people live, so if you have any comments in the live chat, on the stream chat, either on the Twitch or the YouTube, or or perhaps on the TikTok streams, just type away and I'll respond to you in real time. Speaking of this, many years later, Boulez also had ambivalent feelings about Structures, Book 1. So speaking of this, he wrote this in 1951, but when he was very young, but he lived until 2016. So towards the end of his life, in 2011, 60 years later, at age 80, Boulez described it as a piece, quote, in which the responsibility of the composer is practically absent. He said, had computers existed at that time, I would have put the data through them and made the piece that way, but I did it by hand. It was a demonstration through the absurd, the reductio ad absurdum. And when he was asked whether it should still be listened to as music, Boulez replied, I am not terribly eager to listen to it, but for me it was an experiment that was absolutely necessary. So Boulez himself admitted that his approach towards total serialization was on one hand necessary, but was not musical and did not result in musically engaging sounds. So why am I talking about it? I still think that, yes, it is a necessary experiment, but why was it not musical? And for me, the lack of musicality of it is related to the fact that it is not connected to our natural experience of listening, which is that we listen to the proportions of sounds in the overtone series. And in other words, the rhythms and the pitch structures that he isolated and serialized are not really in any perceivable way abstracted from our actual hearing of the sounds from the overtone series. His idea of serialization of was based upon the idea of 12-tone equal temperament, and his distribution of tones is not related to the actual distribution of tones in the overtone series. And likewise, his rhythmic ratios are abstracted from the 12-tone series and so on, and they're all organized in this way. So none of the parameters that you're hearing bear a direct relationship to. And also the attacks, the going from, are also not related to the ways in which we hear attacks within acoustic phenomena, because in any acoustically occurring sound, the greatest intensity of amplitude is at the fundamental, and then the higher partials have less and less. So you're never going to have a louder attack at a higher partial than a lower partial. Yeah. So, but I was inspired by this idea of creating a completely organized structure of sound in which you could understand pitch as an expression of rhythm, rhythm as an expression of pitch, where the duration and the proportions which generate rhythmic ratios are the exact same ratios which generate pitch relations, harmonic relations, structural relations on every level, because my goal is to try to imbue every level of musical structure with that sort of fractal embedding, the same way as in a Schenkerian analysis looks for that fractal embedding of the tonic and dominant in every level of sound, from registers to durations and so on and so forth, phrase levels, etc. So the total serialism, even though it ultimately was an abandoned sort of experiment, particularly in the European version, the way the European composers went about it ultimately did not result in extended music that rewarded this type of sustained attention. I think that was achieved on our side of the Atlantic by Milton Babbitt and by composers who followed his way of teaching tone set, pitch set theory, and combinatoriality. So I do think that the ultimate greater achievement of totally integrating pitch, rhythm, and so on and so forth ultimately was transmitted through the Princeton School, through Babbitt and through his students like Warren and so on and so forth, who I have tremendous respect for. And it's really important parallel development. It was the next phase that I want to talk about. Unlike Babbitt, Boulez was close personal friends with completely different composers. He was completely, I said, not only did he study Western music, he studied non-Western music. Babbitt only studied Western music and jazz. He had no interest in non-Western music. But one of Boulez's closest friends was the great American composer John Cage. Perhaps I shouldn't use the word composer. Cage himself referred to himself as more of an inventor, a conceptualist, an inventor in sound. He was a composer. He did write some very lovely pieces for percussion and voice, especially in the earlier part of his career. I think his string quartet is one of the great 20th century string quartets, up there with Morton Feldman and stuff. But in his post-war period, he was much more of a conceptual artist about working with, you know, what he's most famous for: 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, and chance procedures, music of changes, and so on and so forth. Um, Boulez started incorporating chance procedures into his music, influenced by Cage, some degrees of indeterminacy, at the same time that other European composers started including sort of elements of controlled chance. And in this, he was accompanied by his colleagues Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Yanis Xenakis. I'm sure in future episodes of Music is Revelation, we'll have in-depth dives into what their works mean to me, how I relate my work to the works of Yanis Xenakis and to Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in particular. That incorporation of chance procedures was never on the table for the sort of the Princeton, Columbia, Juilliard 12-tone composers, you know, and who I studied with, who were all about complete notation and complete determinacy. So I am, my music is determinate. There's nothing modular or chance-oriented or algorithmic about my music. I work out every pitch and every rhythm from beginning to end, and it's meant to be performed exactly in tempo without any alterations or changes. But it's also, in the case of some of the continuo pieces like these, also unscored, meaning that the score is the recording of the sinusoids, the continuo, and musicians have got to match the oral score, the heard score, as exactly as possible. So the challenge for live musicians is to listen and to match the pitches and the rhythms as exactly as they possibly can. And within that, there are bound to be tiny deviations between what's set in stone, the continuo, and the live performance, and perhaps that is the element of indeterminacy. But the musical structure itself is completely determinate. I am a determinate composer, not an indeterminate composer. But I also work without scoring. The next phase that is really important to me of Boulez's work was his introduction of electronics and his mixture of electronic sound and acoustic sound. And actually, that goes way back to his early years of studying in the Paris Conservatoire with Olivier Messiaen, because Olivier Messiaen was a pioneer of electroacoustic music, not of concrete, but of working with early electronic instruments, particularly the Onde Martenot, which was a electronic keyboard. It was kind of like a keyed version of the theremin, and it was the tone quality very similar to theremin, but with a keyboard that was able to play like a normal piano keyboard. And his wife Yvonne Loriod was a great virtuoso performer of that instrument, as well as being an incredible pianist. So he had a wonderful collaborator in his wife. So some of Boulez's early works have that influence through Messiaen, and then later he came back to the idea of working with electronics later in his career. So and he achieved a second world historic musical breakthrough with that I want to get into now, which is also tremendously influential and inspiring to me. And Boulez was totally against listening to pre-recorded electronic music in the concert hall, and I agree with him. That's pre-recorded music, that's great to listen to on YouTube, and that's great to listen to, like on your own with headphones. But in a concert hall, he said it was like a crematorium ceremony. A bunch of people sitting there in the dark and respectfully listening to something that was dead. and he was interested in live music making with live musicians, and so am I. Yeah, and making that. So his real interest was in the instantaneous transformation of instrumental sounds, but the technology for that was not available into the founding of IRCAM in the 1970s. There were a lot of pioneers who were moving in that direction of bringing recorded and electronic sounds together with live sounds. And Messiaen's Triangulilla Symphony is a great big symphony that has a sort of, it's kind of like a concerto soloist part for the own Martineau, for example. And there were fantastic transformations of that. Although, you know, if you've ever heard the Triangulilla Symphony live, you know it gets to be a bit much. I mean, Messiaen went over the top, over the top in that one. And I don't know, better to space it out over a couple of nights. But anyway, the an elder visionary of this transformation of sound was the great Franco-American composer Edgar Varese, Varese, and I'll talk about him on a separate episode. Edgar Varese trained in Paris, emigrated to America, and was a great visionary crank, and he was the primary inspiration of another hero of mine, Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa grew up idolizing the work of Edgar Varese, and through that, eventually became friends with Boulez, and much of Frank Zappa's most challenging music was championed by Boulez and the Ensemble Intercontemporain. So this is all connected. Edgar Varese wrote a piece which had a life-changing impact on me, which I'll talk about, called Désert, which was deserts for electronic sound and orchestra. But when he wrote that in the 1950s, he could only just have sort of pre-recorded sections alternating with live music sections. There was no way to create a real live interface between the two. So, as we said, he did, Pierre Boulez wrote some magnetic tape pieces in the early 50s. He wrote 2 etudes in 1951 for magnetic tape in Pierre Schaeffer's Musique Concrète studio in Paris, which was known as the Groupe Recherche de la Radiodiffusion Française. That was a research group of the French radio. And he did a large-scale piece for live orchestra and tape, Poésie pour Pouvoir, 1958, and he withdrew them. He withdrew these pieces, and he felt that he was not able to even achieve a level similar to Varese. And it took like another 20 years, really, for him to find the technology that could bring his vision to life. So it really was a very great heroic quest. And the breakthrough piece, which he completed at IRCAM, was Repon, which he completed between 1980 and 1984, and it's this composition is a life-changing event, and I've heard it performed live a couple of times, and each time I've heard it, it's changed and deepened my very perception of hearing. Repon is a composition by Boulez for a large chamber orchestra with 6 percussion soloists and live electronics. And the 6 soloists play harp, cimbalom, vibraphone, glockenspiel, xylophone, and 2 pianos. Its first version was premiered in 1981. It was not completed until 1985. It was expanded, and with its completed version was 1985. And in it, he has the chamber orchestra and then the audience, and then around the audience are other instruments and loudspeakers and a live feedback system which processes, which listens to the sound of the chamber orchestra and plays it back in altered forms in a so there's, in terms of what you hear, there's an introduction, and then there's sort of 8 kind of big variations or short, movements, and coda. The whole thing is about an hour. It's fantastic span of time. It's and in terms of the meter and the harmony in Boulez said, yes, there is a meter, slightly irregular on one level, but very regular on another. He said there are so many irregular things. At one point, you need to have a regular meter, a bass and a regular pulse, but also a series of harmonies which are all symmetrical. He says the harmony always gives the impression of something followed by its inverse. There is always a center, an axis of symmetry. This symmetry of harmony corresponds in harmonic terms to a regular meter. This is very important. There are 3 types of time. That which is chaotic and irregular, such as you have at the beginning, in the speed, I mean. Then you have in the speed the very regular, rapid, repeated notes, always in semiquavers. Finally, at the end, there is a regularity, a kind of meter, but with much ornamentation. The ornamentation is in fact very irregular, but the meter itself is very regular. And this concept, the way he's describing his music here, is really virtually identical to how I think about harmonic and rhythmic structures in terms of symmetry, of an axis of symmetry and of inversion, creating regularity, and then other things on the surface which seem to be completely irregular. Yeah. And he used the same 6 notes, sort of hexachord, to structure the sounds here. So what you hear are big 6-note chords, which are then in various states of transposition that follow a kind of a 12-tone. So you get like these big 12-tone arpeggios that go all the way from the lowest to the highest, but it's very rich. And this is like a much more successful type of piece because the way you hear it is much closer to actual distribution of pitches in the overtone series, even though it's chromatic. Anyway, in terms of the ensemble, it has 4 groups that sort of with sort of 6 layers each. You've got the 6 soloists: the vibraphone, the glockenspiel, the harp, the cimbalom, and piano 1 and piano 2. And then the woodwinds are flutes, oboes, clarinets, bass clarinet, bassoons. The brass are horns, trumpets, trombones, tuba. Not a very big brass section: 2 horns, 2 trumpets, 2 trombones, tuba. Not a huge brass section, and likewise the 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, plus an additional bass clarinet. So not a huge, a normal sized woodwind section, a fairly classical sized brass section. Very small group of strings: 3 violins, 2 violas, 3 cellos, bass. So the strings are mostly like a soloist. You don't really, there's no big lush string sound at all. And those balances are very hard to get. Believe me, it's very hard to balance just those solo strings against the horns and the woodwinds and all of those keyboard instruments. Yeah, and anyway, it's only been performed a few dozen times in history. I've been lucky; I've been able to hear some of them, and I heard it. For example, I'm in New York at Carnegie Hall, also at the Park Avenue Armory, and when when we heard it at Carnegie Hall, the stage was extended to cover the entire parquet level. So they built out the entire stage. They put sort of a platform, built out a platform over the entire, so covering all the sort of the seats, and musicians were both within and surrounding the audience, and speakers in the electronics in the perimeter and above. So that required extra construction, and yeah, and yeah. So it's very complex in terms of setup, and in fact, Boulez gave its premiere in New York before my time at the Columbia University Gymnasium in March 5th, 1986. He used the 1985 revision with 24 live musicians, 6 live soloists, and a digital processor, a 1980s computer. Hello. And welcome to chat. Welcome, Hulking Saint. Okay. And now it was, at that time, in the original version of 1985, the computer processors were not that great. The processor took in the sounds, changed them in timbre, in volume, other ways, and the regurgitated results, sending the ultrasounds whirling around the hall by dozens of strategically placed loudspeakers. And no sound was left unamplified or untransformed, and so on. There was also a bit of dramatic lighting, in sort of, the lighting gradually came up along with the volume level. And I saw it again. I saw it in 2003 in Carnegie Hall, and the critics mentioned that it was met with an enthusiastic reception, including, quote, a notable numbers of young people in bright T-shirts and scruffy jeans who whooped and whistled after each work. Well, that was me. I was one of those young people in bright T-shirts and scruffy jeans who was whooping and whistling. I loved it. It was great. And another critic from the New York Times said, audiences are ready for some challenges. The idea of Mr. Boulez's music may still seem intimidating, but the music itself is scintillating and restless. Yes, it's gritty and rigorous, but also sumptuous and fanciful. And he described the work as a breathless drama and noted that when the full ensemble played, the music moved quickly in layered, heaving gestures. Yet remarkably, almost every tone of nuance was audible, and when the soloists entered, trading dizzying outbursts and rumination, jazzy riffs from the xylophone, scurrying piano figurations, the sheer visceral excitement of being caught in the middle was like nothing else in music. Absolutely. It was thrilling. When the soloist came in, I mean, initially it just sounds like a kind of a modernistic sort of scherzando piece for chamber orchestra, kind of like post-Stravinsky, and it sounds like late Stravinsky. Very, very good, But then when the soloists come in, I mean, wow. It's like it goes from black and white to in color. It's like that scene from The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy goes through you enter a whole new world of sound. And it was brilliant and thrilling. And Alex Ross, who was also there, noted the performative aspect of the conductor's role at the center of the action. Boulez managed to give precise cues back over his shoulder, his force field radiating 360 degrees. I remember there, yeah. And so some people have put it down. I agree with the French-Canadian musicologist of Jean-Jacques Nattier, who said that Rapone may be viewed as, quote, one of the most significant works of the 20th century. And I agree with him. And that, consistent with Boulez's compositions in general, one of the common praises of Rapone is its internally consistent style. Yes, it doesn't jump from style to style, and it's uses a wide variety of compositional resources, including compositional processing, manipulation of spatial acoustics, and even a quasi-minimalist use of repetitive cells. It uses quite a bit of repetition in these big arpeggios, and which is very entrancing and quite wonderful. Yeah, and the and yeah, and it's a thrilling work. Yeah, and it was there's a Deutsche Grammophon recording that Boulez made with the Ensemble Intercontemporain. He recorded it in 1996. It was released in 1998, and it won a Grammy in 2000 for Best Classical Contemporary Composition. It was, as Tomasini said, an exhilarating performance. I agree. Go seek it out. I believe it's on YouTube, the 2000 Deutsche Grammophon recording of Pierre Boulez's Repos. With that, and his collaborators at IRCAM, Boulez opened up this incredible world of mixing live electronics and acoustic sound in a way which was only imagined by earlier jazz musicians and electronica people, and created a new type of sound world, which is still with us in all sorts of people on the experimental edges of hip hop, jazz, electronica, the more interesting DJs, all around, from Aphex Twin on down. Some other pieces that there was another person responding to that, sort of that magical moment when the keyboards and the process sound enter the piece. What I was talking about. The critic Peter Hayworth described the moment when the soloist's sounds are transformed electronically and projected through space. When that happens, about 10 minutes into the piece, quote, it is as through a great window were thrown open, which a new sound world enters, and with it a new world of imagination. Even more impressive is the fact that there is no longer a schism between the worlds of natural and electronic sounds, but rather a continuous spectrum. And that's the key word I want to repeat. There is no longer a schism between the worlds of natural and electronic sounds, but rather a continuous spectrum. And this is so important to me. I structure my electronic sounds so that they maximally blend with acoustic sounds. That's why I use these very, very simple, noiseless sinusoids, which blend completely into the sounds of a string player or a wind player or a brass player or a percussionist, and which don't draw any attention to themselves, but which give depth, and which also create structure because of the determinate structure of the rhythmic layers and the pitch ratios which I built into my pieces. And so actually then Boulez started with his biggest piece, Repos, and then he sort of took little bits from that and wrote some smaller pieces which are also wonderfully thrilling, such as Dialogue de l'ombre double, the dialogue of the double shadow, which he wrote also between 82 and 85, and for clarinet and electronics. A chamber piece, Explosion Fixe, for 8 solo instruments, also transformed by sound, and flute, MIDI flute, and which responds very well to the live electronics because of the clarity of its pitches and attacks, and the definitive version between 1991 and 1993 for MIDI flute and 2 accompanying flutes with ensemble and live electronics. By this time, the computer could follow the score and respond to triggers from the players, so it could actually, really respond in real time. So it represents a kind of a advance beyond just the live sound processing of Repos into actual score following and interaction. And Again, Paul Griffiths describes it well as the principal flute is caught as if in a hall of mirrors, its line imitating what the other flutes play, and then the contributions of the larger ensemble. And he said his music characteristically caught between thrill and desperation. And Boulez continued to work with live electronics and live computer processing of acoustic sound. Finally, in his Anthem 2, Anthems number 2 for violin and electronics, and which was an electronic reworking of a solo violin piece. And Anthem, which was written in 1991, and then he composed a second version with electronics in 1997. And so it creates a kind of a hyper violin. It produces effects of speed and complexity which no violinist could achieve. But as Jonathan Goldman says, Boulez restricts the palette of electronic sounds so that their source, the violin, is always recognizable. And after that, working with electronics, I think, became too, as he got older, a bit too challenging for him. And that also was true of my teacher, Milton Babbitt. He worked with electronics intensively, but it was extremely exhausting, as it has been for me. And in his last phase of old age, he just returned purely to acoustic music. But these two phases of Boulez's creative output, his sort of climbing the mountain of total serialization and getting every parameter of music to be completely reflective of every other, which he achieved in the early 50s, and then in his achievement in the 1980s and the 90s of integration of live electronics and acoustics through these path-breaking works like Repon in particular. But all of those mixed to me will live forever. And I will also very much appreciate his work as a conductor, but let's be honest. Creating new work is the highest level of achievement. Even the most perfect performance of a great old work is recreation, is recreative, right? There is a creative hierarchy and everyone knows it, and the creator is at the pinnacle. That's the highest level of achievement. And then come the great interpreters, the great performers, the great divas, the great conductors, the great orchestras, And then below that you have the sort of the dramaturgs, the coaches, the people who sort of clarify it, sort of the teachers, and then finally you have the audience, the respectful audience who give the gift of complete undivided attention, who maintain respectful silence and focus and attention and focus 100% of their conscious perception on the sound. But that always, in order to achieve that unity of sonic attention, we must always be aware of that sort of that creative hierarchy with the creator. And this is why in any civilized society we praise the creator of new works more than dead creators of the past or performers or interpreters or pedagogues or anyone else. Yes. And only a degraded society would consider performers or interpreters to be more important than composers or creators. And I'm not saying that because I'm a composer. I'm simply saying it because it's the truth, and we all know that. So, but that was as a conductor that Boulez achieved sort of his widest recognition to an audience, and I'm very glad he had that, and that enabled him to get the resources with which he was able to organize IRCOM. He was a brilliant organizational person as well as being a brilliant musician. He was able to get people together, and he was able to get funding from governmental and non-governmental sources, and he was able to get his vision into reality in a way that I admire and envy. But he was ruthless and he was merciless, and perhaps those are personality characteristics which I'm not in abundance of, and but perhaps wish I could be more in abundance of in order to achieve artistically effective results. And his last works were quite wonderful too. His orchestrations of his notation, where he took his early piano pieces and expanded them and recomposed them for orchestra, are brilliant essays in orchestral sound. I mean, all of the notations are magnificent. I and Sur and Cis is for pianos and harps is quite a beautiful piece, but when are you going to get three pianos and three harps and three percussionists together? I mean, it's something that can really only be performed in conservatory situations. Unfortunately, like Repon, which is, as great as any symphony, just because of the requirements it has for performance, is hardly ever performed. Those performance difficulties are also hinder us from a greater appreciation of later Stockhausen and a lot of Boulez and a lot of the composers I was talking about. So I try to work with more conventional musical ensembles as much as possible, because I don't want to write something, to put my heart and soul into something, and then to have it to remain unperformed. No one does. Okay, so I think this is my centennial tribute to Pierre Boulez, and we really need to recognize the seriousness of his commitment to high modernist ideals, and even if those are unfashionable today, just like in the movie The Brutalist, people cheer when brutalist buildings are blown up now because that style of architecture is no longer in fashion, but that does not change the fact that the great brutalist architects, Louis Kahn and Marcel Breuer, achieved magnificent masterpieces in their medium, masterpieces which should be treasured forever. Same thing with the somewhat brutalist but still fantastic achievements of Pierre Boulez. And okay, well, I think that's enough for today's episode. So yeah, I think until we meet again, I want to continue to our joint exploration of the worlds of sound and sonic perception together. So see you soon. Let's keep listening. Let's stay focused. Let's stay positive. Okay. Bye-bye.